colleagues across the globe as we've had. Look, I just want to welcome everyone again, and we're in for an exciting conversation with Jonathan today of World Vision. Today's a co-hosted event from the UNDP Innovation Facility, together with Gahi, and we have Leslie Florence here from the Alliance on Humanitarian Innovation. Very excited to be able to talk about scale and this ever sort of Damocles that we have on scaling and how do we get into that thinking around scaling around the innovations we do. Look, let me just turn it over to you, Leslie, if that's okay, for a few words maybe to frame the conversation and tell us a little bit what Gahi does, and then we'll go over to you, Jonathan. Thank you again for coming today.
Sure. I thought I'd just explain to people what Gahi is, in case you're not familiar with it. So the Global Alliance for Humanitarian Innovation grew out of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. Can you guys hear me back there? I see some people leaning forward. Yeah, okay. And there was a focus on innovation throughout the preparations for that summit, really recognizing that while there's quite a lot of innovation in the humanitarian system, it can be scattered or kind of issue-oriented or focused really on pilots and testing and not as much on really scaling solutions. So out of that, this Global Alliance was born to look at two main things. One, how to promote collaboration around innovation in the humanitarian space and bring people together around common solutions. So not just investing in a lab here or a capacity there, but really crowding around issues that matter, like refugee education, where many different institutions could get involved. And the second thing is really around scaling, which we're going to talk about today. So again, moving out of just kind of experimentation and projectization and into how to bring truly good ideas to people who need them in a lot of places. So the Gahi is a pretty new endeavor, and so we haven't really supported many projects, but we just launched one collaboration with Education Cannot Wait. In fact, I think it was announced today, to work with an education kind of coalition and board to try to promote scaling of solutions that are discovered for education in emergencies, particularly with refugees. So that's the kind of work that we want to be doing. And two of our members, UNDP and World Vision, we're happy to be working with on this. We have about 35 members. They're UN agencies, think tanks, companies, governments. And we're always looking for more. So if people hear from others or have thoughts about people who might want to join this work, we're very interested in hearing from you. So I'll leave it there for now, and then we can go back and forth a little on some ideas about scale maybe when you're done.
Thank you. Over to you, Jonathan.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you to UNDP and thank you to Gahi for co-hosting this session. I'm really quite excited about it. I think it's fundamental for the kinds of work that UNDP does as a leader in this space of fragility, and for Gahi, which is really trying to help the humanitarian community, which has been projectized for the most part, how to get to outcomes. And that's very much consistent with what I'll be talking about today. Let me first say that scaling overall is a rather murky space. 3 years ago, I joined a community of practice on scaling global outcomes, which is curated by Johannes Lin from the Brookings Institution for Results for Development. He is no stranger to UNDP, has done a great deal of work inspiring and helping write some scaling strategies for UNDP. And Larry Cooley, who is the founder of Management Systems International, MSI, and one of the world's scaling gurus, along with Johannes and others. And I'm a member of the scaling community, but I'm also a chair of a group on fragile states and scaling, which has multilateral institutions. We've got UNDP, we've got IFAD, we've got the African Development Bank and the OECD, several major donors, including USAID. We've got Duke University and Stanford, and we've just got MIT JPAL to join as well. We have Intel Corporation and several others. So, and I should also mention the Overseas Development Institute, Alistair McKechnie, who wrote with the African Development Bank their new strategy on scaling and fragility. So it's a privileged space to be kind of thinking about this work. And it was part of our incubator for a paper that Larry Cooley and I did called Tipping the Scales. And if we can tee up the presentation, that's part of what I want to unpack today. And if you haven't seen the paper already, which was in, I think, the invitation link, Malika has kindly agreed to send that and some other materials on the subject. So let me begin by, thank you very much, starting. So I'll start by unpacking the title as our way into the process. And the pun is intended here, we need to tip the scales more and more towards fragile states or fragile contexts, and I'll use those terms interchangeably. By 2030, 80% of the world's extreme poor is projected to be in these contexts. They're places where conflict is increasingly concentrated and which have the highest vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters. So they really occupy the center of the global development crisis in many ways. Now, our response to this major crisis, this major challenge, has really been projectized, as a friend from Gabi just mentioned. We constantly work through piecemeal, short-term, uncoordinated projects. And this significantly limits the pathways to getting to the Sustainable Development Goals and major impact. But it's also having a more perverse effect as well on the very institutions of government. As Claire Lockhart and Ashraf Ghani, who's now the president of Afghanistan, have documented, not only are we creating parallel systems of expensive procurement and process, but in other cases, we're training and building ministries of agriculture and health and others to be project clearinghouses. So they're actually stepping away from their larger capacity and goals to renegotiate the social contract through major programs, national programs. This is also documented by Susan Hayward at Princeton as well. So there's this collective consciousness now that we've got to get away from project approaches, this idea of this piecemeal short-term work. So how do we begin to do that in a place as challenging as a fragility context? Well, the first thing we have to come to terms with is that most of the work that we do in traditional humanitarian and development contexts is about meeting needs. We're trying to meet life-saving needs in the humanitarian space, and we're trying to meet sustainable long-term needs in the development space through building human capital and knowledge transfer and assistance and financing, etc. And this is key. But in fragile contexts, we're dealing with a risk factor that's much higher. And so the OECD has stepped into this and basically talked about fragility as a condition where the risks and the capacities are in disproportionate ratio. So higher risk of conflict, higher risk of disaster, and less capacities for dealing with them. Japan has major risks of tsunami and earthquake, but it's not fragile because it has capacities for dealing with them. Springs on skyscrapers, advanced remote sensors, emergency protocols. Haiti does not have that. And so the earthquake really devastated. So the first piece then is for us to start thinking, if we're going to start doing this meaningfully in fragile states, implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, bringing humanitarian action into a much more cohesive, scalable process, we've got to onboard risk. Now, UNDP wrote a good report a year or two ago on implementing the SDGs in fragile contexts. And there's a key passage in there that kind of goes into what I'm saying here. Is we've got to shift from the MDG mindset or logic, which is about ending poverty, economic growth, sector support, and into a new kind of what we're calling an SDG logic, which is de-siloed, integrated, risk-informed, in other words, resilient, and focused on managing multiple pieces at once. So how do we begin to do that? Well, the OECD takes their definition and plots it out across multiple countries. And it arrives at a list of about 56 countries that are fragile. And within that, it's got an extreme category from Somalia over to Mali, which are dealing with really high risk and very low capacities. And so this gives you a sense of how it's playing out, the risk and condition piece. So it's quite an interesting exercise on the OECD's part. What we're measuring here is not simply the risk factors politically, socially, security-wise, but it's the capacities as well. I was a member of the OECD's advisory group this year for the report coming up in July, next month. In July. Not quite there yet, just next month. And it was a fascinating exercise to see sort of how we're wrestling places that do have higher risks, but more capacities for dealing with them. Now, what's striking about this, and especially for the scaling piece, is that we're not simply dealing with security and instability. Sometimes fragility gets reduced down to those factors. So if we're looking at the inner band here on security, you can see that for the extreme, a fair amount of them are dealing with security challenges. And over here in Libya, you can also see here in Pakistan as well. But for the most part, it's a complex set of other risks, other pathways. stemming from political and societal risks and economic and environmental and complex interactions, but they're not all heading pathways to conflict and just instability. So as one way of illustrating this, the Brookings Institution a couple of months ago did a paper on the most severely off-track countries to meet SDG 1 on extreme poverty. And they said, we're having a hard time plotting this over onto fragile states, but we can see that they're fragile. And the reason why they couldn't plot it very well was that they were using the Fragile States Index, which is essentially a measure of instability, and also plotting on the World Bank's Fragile States list, which is kind of geared towards conflict and low income. And the contours and shape of fragility have changed. Now, when you plot the Brookings 31 countries on this list, you see that 30 of 31 are here. The only exception that's not here is Benin. So we've got to be looking at the entire package of fragility and thinking about how are we going to solve for extreme poverty, disasters, and conflict, and trying to get to some of the root causes. So this helps us then start to define what's the scaling challenge. If we're going to do this, what are the special challenges of scaling for these places and that make them different than traditional contexts? The one is that we're starting off with compromised platforms. If you're in a normal development context, you're either scaling through government or you're scaling through the private sector. But in these contexts, they're somehow compromised. They're uncoordinated, there's low capacity, there's limited reach, they're dysfunctional, or there's been elite capture over these processes. So we've got to find a way of thinking, how are we going to scale through and somehow build that capacity? There's underlying grievances. And you can see that in the OECD list, where you've got high political and societal fragility, manifest in different ways across the diversity of the spectrum, but everything that you're doing has some kind of symbolic or material grievance associated with it. There are trust issues that can halt the scaling project upfront if it's not managed, or can lead to conflict or disruption downstream. That's the other piece here. There's higher vulnerability to shocks and stress. This is what we've been saying. That's the real differentiator between traditional context and one that you're dealing with in fragile contexts, where it's a higher vulnerability to shocks and stress, and there's a root cause to that. So we've got to unpack that, including grievances, broken institutions, etc. And as we've been saying as well, there's a high reliance on external and unpredictable resources that crowd in during a humanitarian phase and then leave a financing gap of potentially years before some kind of concessional loan structure can come in. So there's a need to begin to rehabilitate how we're doing development assistance, humanitarian assistance in these contexts, especially if we're going to have hope of trying to get to these platforms and trying to build something out over time. So we can then start to define the scaling challenge in fragile states as one that is meeting widespread need across the board, meeting the SDG goals, just similar to other traditional contexts, but also finding a way to adapt to shocks and stress through that process. So in scaling, we're not talking about how are we brokering political settlements, how are we mediating specific conflicts, how are we doing things outside development. We're talking about how are we using the developmental process itself to somehow support and complement. This very much affirms what the Pathways report for peace says as well, in the sense that resilience and prevention will come through development processes and through people for whom development or conflict is not the main concern. So there's this need, this Herculean need, I should mention, to really get bigger on how we're doing development in a more scaled and sophisticated way. And the last piece is addressing root causes. So it's not enough to simply look at the risks, the shocks and the stress. What is the underlying features of that? And how can we do anything through scaling, through the presentation of material dividends, through services, through crowding in people around common development projects to somehow get to root causes. So our first step then is to think, how are we going to accomplish this triple bottom line? Managing resources to meet widespread need, managing risks, managing root causes. Well, the first thing we need to do is come to a new idea of what scaling really is. If you've come from the innovation community, some of the received wisdom that you're getting is that scaling is this sort of secondary, slightly boring process. And what you're really focused on is the breakthrough innovation, the thing that will disrupt, deconstruct, etc. Or that winning pilot project. Let's see if this thing works in one space? And if it does, then let's start thinking about how to scale it. And the reality is quite the opposite. Scaling is not a secondary process to an innovation or pilot project. It's actually the larger framework from which to think about crowding in various types of projects and innovations to meet a large-scale goal. That's exactly what Leslie said around refugee education as an outcome, and looking at what kinds of projects can you layer in, what kinds of interventions to get there. So think also about if you're trying to meet the SDG goal around renewable energy. If you had one project in mind around renewable energy off-grid, that's great. You've got a series of things there. But what about hydroelectric? What about cities and urban versus rural? You simply can't try to do it through one project. If you're trying to do, you have a new shiny youth employment program, but you're not looking at SME growth or the market or the value chain system, that project alone is not going to meet the outcome. So what scaling does is it offers what we call an organizing framework from which to build out an assessment and a management framework for change around a specific outcome. This has also become central in fragile states where you might have a specific scaling pathway for, say, a water outcome. You're trying to build boreholes and infrastructure to build water out. But if there's a crisis, how do you then take that path, that winning pilot project on, here's how we've linked boreholes and water to behavior change so that we have this little project. What if it gets disrupted? The default in places like South Sudan is that the development piece goes away and goes back into the humanitarian sphere. But what if you were to plan out in the scaling process a mode where you can start building in a scenario where you can't do the wells anymore, but can you truck water in? And you can't truck water in, but you can use packets of purifying pills that clean the water. So scaling as an organizing framework gives you a space from which to integrate multiple types of programs and interventions. And it does this essentially by looking at what we think of as three main factors of the scaling process. The one is, what is the vision for scaling? What is the major outcome? What's the SDG? What are the series of SDGs that you can start building tracks around? Because these are integrated and unified pieces. The MSI framework is the one that we've been using. It's been around for about 13 years. It's been field tested over that period of time and constantly revised. 2016 was the last revision of it. And it basically walks you through what you would consider the blind spots of the scaling process. So it's not just the realization you want to scale a specific vision for scaling. It's how do you assess that? And there's a checklist process in the framework for figuring out how difficult it's going to be. It then walks you through the process of getting political support. How do you do it? Where do you move it? A lot of times people go to the Prime Minister's office right away and think, we've got the Prime Minister's delivery unit ready to go, and therefore off we go, we're off to the races. Then the Prime Minister changes 2 years later and the whole thing falls down. So how do you distribute political support across the various agencies? It then walks you through how do you get social support? And how do you build out, for example, in polio vaccinations, there's a major stigma at times around polio. People think if you give it the vaccine, their child's going to get it. So you've got to be constantly working at all these pieces together. And this framework actually gives you that sort of organizing piece to think through all these moving parts. The other piece of that is it starts talking about mobilizing resources. And it gives you foresight into a process where you say, what is the pathway to scale in this specific context? And what kinds of financing are we going to need over this period of time? And so it allows a series of partners to come together around a process like this and begin to structure what it will look like in a specific context. And it can help, therefore, as we argue in the paper, solve collective action problems around understanding the process and the problem set. Oftentimes donors and others don't want to get social support or do political economy analysis. All of these pieces are fundamental to this process. But also, how can we start in using a systematic framework like this to also start thinking about how do we link concessional loans to, say, humanitarian funding or impact funds or bonds. Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccinations, has a very successful bond market from which they use to get innovations to fragile states and other places. How do we start grouping this together? One example is cash transfers. In a disaster, you have emergency cash transfers. how do you start building a process from that stage with all that money and all that incentive of banks now seeing money crowding in, start building social safety nets through regulatory support and political support and commercial support, etc. This is exactly what we're working on in Haiti right now. So this scaling framework as an organizing framework allows for multiple partners to come together and pool resources, technical expertise, and get around key issues like political and social support that are needed. So, and in the process of doing that, it allows you to then phase in or layer various projects or interventions that together will be able to move forward on this. Now, it's presented here as a sequence, as a 1, 2, 3, the little acorn grows into a tree. That's only done for convenience sake. In reality, these are highly nonlinear processes. In essence, they're adaptive processes, where you're not trying to first get your plan and then get your political support. In essence, you could be getting the political support first, which we see in places like Afghanistan for the National Solidarity Project that scale rapidly the program. So instead of the metaphor for scaling being this mechanistic secondary process, almost like a conveyor belt that moves the breakthrough innovation forward, the metaphor is actually closer to a Rubik's Cube, where you're constantly trying to move the cube and find a technical intervention or set of interventions that will help reach an outcome. But if you get that all lined up and you haven't lined up the other side of the cube, that's the political support, you've got to keep working the cube, and the social, and the environmental, etc. Now, you recently had a talk here by Yuan Ang, who's a close colleague of mine. We've talked about her sort of really groundbreaking work on China, really in scaling terms, because China took a huge directed outcome for meeting economic growth, building economic growth. And it was very adaptive in taking a series of different models and projects, et cetera, to try and get there. And the whole point being that there is not a specific model. It's really about how you organize the larger outcome and then allow for adaptation, co-creation, and improvisation in that process. And that's very much what we're talking about here. So this is all fine and good. We have an organizing framework focused on outcomes, and it can be a space for solving collective action problems and starting to get to that scaling problem of disparate piecemeal projects to help governments or the private sector move forward. That's great. But our challenge and our bar is set much higher in private states, because we're only potentially then solving one of the triple bottom lines, meeting widespread need through a process like this. And as we know, if we do that, and we're not building for shocks and stress, or trying to manage some of the root causes that could down the whole thing subsequently, then we're not really doing it. We're not making a scaling process fit for purpose. So in that sense, we've got to find a way of incorporating into this modality a process for building resilience and for accelerating or being the driver for getting down root causes or helping to manage them. Now, when we look at the mounting evidence for building resilience to both shocks and stress, this comes from Daniel Aldrich's work on disaster recovery, comes from the work that USAID is doing with Tango International and Tim Frankenberg on food security, using food security solutions to also build resilience to shocks and stress in places like East Africa. There's an emerging consensus that what drives that process is a concept called social capital. Now, social capital sometimes gets talked about interchangeably with social cohesion or social solidarity, etc. It's actually a very technical term. It has 3 dimensions. The one is bonding. It's bringing together groups and communities of like-mindedness to share resources, pool funds, provide self-help in terms of crisis, in times of crisis or preparation, and also provide psychosocial support. So it's the first line of defense around a crisis. The second is bridging. This is bringing together people that are perhaps different or unconnected across geographies, sometimes perhaps divided, and trying to find things that they have in common interest, whether it's health or education or water user associations, and trying to find ways of bringing those communities together. This becomes increasingly important for the recovery process, as Aldrich and others have stated as well. And the last piece is linking. And this is not just having a grassroots type of engagement, but actually trying to link to formal institutions. Government, for greater responsiveness, access to information, can also be to formal institutions like banks or financing facilities to access funds for recovery as well. Now, the kicker is that to do this well, they all have to be done together, which essentially means we need a scaling approach to doing this, to vertically connect multiple pieces of government and to connect wide geographies as well. The other kicker is that so that's the sort of what somebody might be saying, that's the ideal. If you can get all three together, great, you can scale that. But the other kicker is that when you don't do all three together, then you can have negative consequences. So if you begin the process of bonding without bridging, you could be strengthening communities that are divided and making them stronger apart. If you do bridging without bonding, you're having very shallow forms of cooperation that don't bring in full communities, and therefore limit the amount of resilience that you get. And if you do linking without bridging, you could be building clientist or patronage networks or reinforcing those as well. So in a sense, to really move forward on social capital and to use it as a driver in this space, we need a scaling strategy. And the reverse is also true. You need this strategy to really scale this context. And so we incorporate this into the model, and as we discussed in the paper. Now, it turns out that the process of building social capital is not just important for building resilience to shocks and stress, but it actually has a bigger bearing on the whole triple bottom line. So in the paper, we talk about this really fascinating program that USAID and its partners pioneered called the wave sequence / the slice system. And they've tried this out in very difficult contexts, in Gaza, in Afghanistan, there's one that I'm missing, Afghanistan, I believe Rwanda as well. And the idea here is that they took primary healthcare interventions. They wanted to meet primary healthcare goals, cutting infant and maternal mortality in half, for example. And instead of starting at a project level, they start at a countrywide level or a major set of district levels. And they have project teams all lined up, starting the scaling process all at once across the board. And they begin to look at who is doing the work successfully, who's making it happen, and where's the variation coming from, where's the winning strategy. And from there, they begin to bring those teams together and start scaling the rest of the places. So they start with one slice of a district and they kind of then scale forward. Now, one of the major puzzles that they found was when they first started doing this, the first wave sequence from the initial intervention into the beginning of scale, they had moderate outcomes, 40 to 50%. But in the second and third wave, it dramatically spiked, sort of in the 80s. And what they basically attribute that to is, as you get further into the scaling process, it's more of the domestic agents of scaling coming together that have shared worldviews, language, customs, and ways of communicating, taking the foreign technical kind of intervention and translating and smoothing out pieces so that it actually moves very fast. So we look at that in the paper.
Can you give us a little bit more detail about the example? I'm not following exactly what this intervention was about.
So it's about, thanks. So it's about scaling primary healthcare interventions, right? So it's about how do we take a package of basic healthcare packages for primary care and begin to introduce those across a set of health clinics and hospitals very widely. So they're not starting with one project, they're starting with several projects or interventions. And they start to then use that as a laboratory for learning. So they thought, okay, we have this they were taking essentially an adaptive approach. Let's create variation and then selection, what's winning, and how do we share that? What they weren't expecting was this major dramatic spike in the outcomes, which they then attribute to the socialization of the process, the building of it. And so for us, that bears out this notion that social capital is working in this context and move forward. When we then look further into the process, we start to see bonding, bridging, and linking working. So this intervention started with USAID and others working with the formal health ministries and the clinics and hospitals, but also connecting with communities, the informal voluntary healthcare workers. So there's this linking happening there. They're also starting in their own districts, these high-performing teams, and so there's a bonding phase there. They're actually working there. But then they're brought together across regions to start figuring out how to join up the intervention and build together, rapidly sharing and adapting. And there's a bridging piece as well. So we use that as an example of, while it's seemingly unexplainable in some contexts, it's the driver of social capital that can accelerate the developmental process as well. In addition to building resilience to shocks and stress, it actually has that function. Now, Francis Fukuyama talks a great deal about social capital in his work as well, looking at state building, where he says, in the absence of formal mechanisms for commitment and coordination and incentive, it's the social capital underneath that keeps the thing moving, especially in fragile states. And so we really shine a light on this piece because it tells you in the scaling process what you should be looking at, how you should be organizing the scaling model. The piece I've already covered is around incorporating the risk and resilience principles into the process to build resilience to shocks and stress. And we give an example of the World Economic Forum's 5 Rs: robustness, redundancy, recovery, response, resourcefulness, and how this can get layered in through social capital to drive resilience. And the last piece, which is quite interesting, is how does social capital potentially play out in a scaling approach to looking at root causes? So the Overseas Development Institute recently concluded a 6-year panel study asking the question, does service delivery given by the government lead to state legitimacy? And there's this underlying assumption, you still see it sometimes in solicitations from donors and others. If you build services and the government is seen as part of that, then they'll get a hit on legitimacy, it will spike up. And the findings from ODI, and I should say the Securing Livelihoods Research Consortium in particular, which is doing great work, is not necessarily at all. They found that where services drop under that government's watch, they get a negative hit on legitimacy, but where services are provided, they don't necessarily get greater legitimacy. So there's a piece there, there's a riddle. What they found to be far more instrumental was the narrative. What's the government saying? How is then the service signaling a positive approach to something else? How inclusive is the process? And so, and this is the Pathways report as well, puts a huge premium on narrative, as does the recent Fragility Commission report that Paul Collier and David Cameron did. And so, if you're taking a normal sort of traditional approach to scaling service delivery in these contexts and thinking that's going to lead to state legitimacy, there's some correctives in the process. But if you're taking a scaling approach that brings multiple partners together around looking at things like popular and political support, et cetera, but introduces an idea of social capital as an organizing principle, we could say, then you're going to be a lot more attentive to opportunities of linking government and informal communities with the narrative. How can you use it? And if you're going very big in terms of scaling major outcomes, how do you then change patterns of inclusion through this process of development? Building the narrative and building in this focus of bridging as well. So it's not just clientistic type of framework, it's the bridging piece as well. So we have an organizing framework that's looking at outcomes and that can help guide partners to overcome collective action. We have what we could call an organizing principle around social capital that can show how to accelerate and build resilience to shocks and stress, and also provide a framework for then introducing narrative and other pieces into the puzzle of strengthening the social contract. But in very extreme cases of fragility, where the pathways are completely compromised, and you can't start using these processes to build a stronger government performance or the private sector, like you could in Kenya, for example, and Cambodia and Tanzania, which are on the list as well, then we've got to take a different kind of approach. And we refer to that approach as a hybrid ecosystem. Hybrid in the sense that it's bringing multiple communities and partners together, and it's creating a network system out of that that's looking at things like social capital and building popular and political dialogue and support. So one of the most dramatic and I think impactful examples of this is the Afghanistan basic healthcare package, which scaled up relatively rapidly over a period of 4 or 5 months, and actually met its MDG goal of cutting infant and maternal mortality in half by 2015. Now, the way it did it was that the ministry was supported, probably by UNDP, definitely by the World Bank, to build up capacity to set a set of priority outcomes. So it said we want to do preventive care. Now, incidentally, they actually had to push back on the cabinet a bit, which was much more interested in focusing on curative care. There was an elite network that really wanted that, and they were investors, and they had sway, and so they wanted that process. But you could think of it as sort of a collective action. Donors and the ministry pushed back and said we really need to be working on preventive. So the ministry set the goals and was supported to help coordinate various partners. Now, they didn't have the capacity to reach get out to different parts of Afghanistan, and so it began a procurement process where it pulled together UN agencies and NGOs to be its operational arms, and actually go out to various places, start building these or delivering these services. And those partners began to connect with communities. and build up their capacities through their own logic models, through the community empowerment process, etc. So you then created this whole network, this ecosystem, through the process of international capacities blending with formal and informal. And it was able to scale using that process, especially even in very difficult conflict-affected places. And there are studies that show sort of how it worked around extremist threats, how it worked around the Taliban, with where they were at the district level, went through the village level, and then went up, etc. So it's a fascinating example. It was a government-led consortia with international implementing partners, community empowerment, and it worked off a pooled funding system. So it brought multiple funding together. Now, at one point in the process, one very major donor to the thing, their inspector general said, we have to pull out. There's way too much vulnerability to corruption in this process. We have to leave. But it was the momentum of the process. It was the fact that it was delivering and it had so many partners around it that the donor agency was able to sort of stay in. Their aid department was able to make the case. So this can be very powerful as an organizing framework in using these kinds of blended systems. Now, the other example is around polio. And this is a consortium called the Core Group Polio Project that World Vision has been leading for about 9 years. Instead of having one government leading a process in country, it has a global focus. So it's actually trying to eradicate polio across the board. And it does that by bringing together basically partners to pool funds. A major partner is USAID through a congressional earmark of about 150 million, but it also brings them from Rotary, it brings them from the Gates Foundation and others. So it pools the funding as well through the process. And it has operational secretariats in multiple fragile contexts, which are the last line for polio. And it's those processes, it's those operational secretariats on the ground that then begin the process of gaining political support and social support. So there's blue ribbon campaigns. There's a massive effort from the traditional leader to the mayor, to the district chief, to the governor, all the way up to the sub-region and to even the president's office. There's tremendous support for the process. Now, the work is done where we have basically social capital injection. We have community healthcare workers working in these contexts, and that's all they do. Socialize, facilitate, smooth, troubleshoot. And they report both to the project and to the government as well. So it's a process then of bringing together massive social care workers that are agents basically of scaling, helping to smooth out and socialize, that do bonding functions and bridging functions, but are also linked to the system as well for sustainability. So that's another example. And the last one here is SOMREP, which is another consortium that World Vision helped to stand up and is currently the lead of. It's in Somalia, and basically is scaling food and security livelihoods across the country, including conflict-affected South Central, but also Somaliland and Puntland, while building resilience. And it has 7 international partners and 9 local partners. And it has a pooled technical secretariat that breaks up the idea that every project has its own sort of pathway, etc. There's actually a shared technical secretariat that looks at sort of all the projects, all the interventions, and continually looks at how do we bridge them together, layer, coordinate, etc. And we've increasingly been doing the work of linking, helping the government write the national strategy on resilience, facilitating contact between government and communities. So it plays an intensive role at sort of the bonding phase, bridging across wide communities, and also doing the linking increasingly. So we see these as very important in places where you can't scale through traditional means, but the scaling function is essential. Now, the last I heard is that these are being talked about, these kinds of hybrid mechanisms, and the basic healthcare package in particular, in South Sudan, as well as in Somalia. So it's an opportunity here to really sort of weigh in and lean in. And the last slide basically talks about, great, wonderful. You've got an organizing framework, you've got, a social capital organizing principle that will really help you accelerate some of these processes and build resilience, but who's going to do it? Where's the catalyst? So the function of scaling coordination then becomes outsized. And it's essentially a process of looking at the traditional nuts and bolts of scaling, so aligning innovators and funders and scaling agents around major SDG outcomes. But it's also this process of then cultivating and directing social capital, looking at a broader resilience assessment, looking at a political economy assessment and saying, where are we going to come into problems? How are we introducing adaptive, iterative approaches here? How are we actually looking at, we're doing too much bonding in these cases without bridging? Are we not doing linking? Or are we doing linking but without bridging, and therefore creating and enforcing sort of elite capture and patronage networks. And the coordination function is also one in which then you have to bring in multiple partners. How are you doing that? How are you engaging? How are you doing it across the humanitarian and development divide? How are you developing campaigns for popular support and engaging in co-creation? So the scaling coordination function is best done, ideally, within a government process. So it's the Minister of Health, or like it was in the Afghanistan Basic Package Service, or a Minister of Planning, but there needs to be outside support looking at this bigger paradigm. And I would see UNDP as playing a fundamental role in being able to get into that intermediation or scaling coordination role to really support this very big picture work. And as the administrator recently said, I think in a conversation at the Center for Global Development, we're trying to manage complexity in these places as UNDP, as well as bring best practice from other contexts as well. And so we're continually looking now at this kind of function. And Larry and I, our next step is to sort of develop more of the tools and frameworks and templates to get into the scaling piece at this intermediation level of how you coordinate. My final comment is that not everything should be scaled. It's a highly intensive, expensive, long-term process, on average about 10 to 15 years. And it's not a panacea. If you have an organizing framework and these sort of guidelines and modalities, there's no guarantees. It's just a space to begin to think about how to get rid of and overcome the project focus and start blending resources, expertise, and focus into key areas that are usually blind spots for us. So in doing that, our hope is that we can help to eventually tip some of those scales in favor of fragile societies and fragile states. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jonathan. It was very informative and also had it comes a very important moment for UNDP. Really knows you're working on this concept. How do we really get to that point of value connection issue and bridging and then linking, if you will? Quite interesting material for us to think over. Let me just throw it open. Maybe we have good chunk of time. How much? About 15 minutes.
So yeah, we have about 15 minutes for questions. And what I just did want to flag is do remember to sign that lovely sheet with the presentation and other resources that Jonathan has mentioned today.
Thanks very much. So we have a good 15 minutes. We haven't done a round of introductions, so whoever asks a question will now introduce themselves. And let me also do a quick check with Etty. Do we have anyone online at all that if they want to ask questions? You monitor that. Good. Let's throw it open. Thank you. Introduce yourself. Thank you.
I'm Yomina from UNDP. Specifically, I work with the Global Partnership for Collective Development Cooperation, which specifically works on SDG 17, monitoring progress on SDG 17. So my question specifically is, great framework. I mean, personally, I love it. Having worked in JPL and IPA, Yale's IPA,
Yeah.
This approach is almost like a nightmare for them, though, I would imagine, because to them, it's all about isolating independent variable, piloting, and getting that pilot right, even if it takes 5 years, and then thinking about scaling, and sometimes that conversation doesn't even get there. So I guess my question is, and again, there may be an answer for it, there may not be, but how do you get this approach on the field with networks that are established, like JPL, IP, they're working with like hundreds of academics and organizations worldwide and governments, but how do you get these established organizations to change their mindset and actually think about scaling up more so than piloting?
It's funny you say this. I think when I was talking about the polio example, I was thinking about your outfit, the global partnership piece, because it is a sort of a global, there are ways of doing it at a global level, muster resources. Funny you should mention this because Esther Dunfla, one of the leading minds at JPL, just co-authored an article 2 days ago about the need to get past the piecemeal project work and into scaling. And so looking at sort of how you do this with randomized work, I haven't gone through the whole paper yet because it just came out, but I would assume mixed methods have to be a fundamental aspect of it. The more you can develop evidence around what's happening, it's shown time and again to drive the scaling process. So I'm happy to point out that piece to you if you like.
Sure.
Yeah.
We also have Laura.
Yeah, we have Laura on the back, and then I had someone else. Okay, no, go ahead.
Good, thanks for doing it. Thanks, Jonathan. That was a really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask a question more about the last point you made on finding that catalyst and landing this. And you gave the example of some government ministries, Ministry of Planning or Health and so on, that can help coordinate that. And one of the things that's definitely a challenge for us, and it was something flagged in the Pathways report as well, how do we do this kind of work where the government is uncooperative, where the government is part of the problem, where levels of polarization are already quite high, where risks have escalated to a point of politicization beyond which, we have a limited set of options, quite frankly, to try to unlock a situation. So just a reflection, where do you see sort of entry points and what does scaling look like to you in those kinds of contexts?
Great, that's a great question. So I think the one side is, as you know, we have to sometimes unpack what we call a government, because there are highly politicized elements and there are parts that are genuinely trying to do good work, agriculture and education. Education can sometimes get very politicized, but health, these can, so kind of moving one step down and looking at who can you work with in any given place. That can be one of the entry points that you can't figure out ex ante, right? You just have to see what's there. In places where nobody can work with at a meaningful level of engagement, that kind of SOMRET model, and in aid effectiveness language we call shadow alignment, where you're trying to do this kind of scaling work, and when the moment is ready, then you can kind of connect. You're trying to then find those linkage moments. Scaling is a long-term process, in part because of these variables where you don't have the political support right away, but with enough partnerships and focus and waiting for those pivot moments or openings, if you're ready for it, then that's the key entry point. And so, I mean, that's where in South Sudan, for instance, we're doing so much development work at one point and then everything falls back down. If we have a plan or a set of contingencies to say, when this falls down, we're going to do X, and we're still going to be working with these ministries. That's sort of the mind shift that we have to have beyond the project. You simply can't get there thinking about a project, right? But you can get there thinking about a wider momentum process that you're building and constantly creating, then you've got more potential. And when you've got the pool fund process as well, I think there's something there that you keep trying to build off of. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Nick Reader. I currently work in UNDP's Bureau for Europe and Central Asia. I was previously actually with the polio eradication program. I was housed in UNICEF as part of the partnership. And I'm really glad to see the reflection that you've done around this. And I think you've done a fantastic job of sort of translating all of that global chaos into some sort of coherent framework that seems sort of coherent and replicable. I guess a question, a comment. My question is whether there's also a sort of parallel initiative happening to capture the actual operational networks that these sort of initiatives that are taking this kind of framework forward have already built up. I mean, polio eradication has got, as you know, tremendous reach into just the social mobilization network, thousands of people going door to door. Is there some effort to sort of look at how you can harness the networks and the knowledge and the mapping and all the satellite imagery and everything that's been correlated just for that, maybe for other programs as well, to apply it, so we're not going back to zero with everything? Because I don't know where that stuff lives if it does, but not just us, the private sector, militaries, the government, everybody's been doing this work, but where do we put it together? I think my comment is, so I just wanted to take you up on one of the last things you said, which was that there's an 8 to 15 year time frame on this. I think there's actually, if you look at polio eradication, it's more like a 50 to 60, 70 year time frame. Seriously, that's what it takes to actually move the needle on global things. And I wonder if we don't also need to have a forum in which we can have a conversation about, well, what maybe in the space of a generation we can really globally move the needle on one or two of these really intransigent, difficult, deeply rooted problems, particularly when it touches on such complex contexts. And what do we want that next, what's that next one going to be? It's not something that we can do on all 17 SDGs, for example. That's just not realistic financially, operationally, the amount of work that goes into keeping these partnerships alone together for that duration. I think it's super complex.
So, great comments.
Yeah.
The one thing about scaling that we talk about is, you're right, you've got to pick some very strategic initiatives. And part of the criteria for picking it is, what initiative can you do that will lay down tracks for other initiatives? So how can you begin a process of health where you're building infrastructure that can later support water and sanitation, or health, or nutrition types of interventions. So where do you get the biggest multiplier effect? That should be one of the considerations, including building up these sort of community volunteers. How can they be used for crisis moments as well? So trying to figure out where your multiplier points are. Cash could also be one, where you're looking at how you're creating digital cash systems that support social safety nets, but also support every other piece of the puzzle as well, livelihoods, etc. The other question about sort of where's the capture of the operations and the agents and the learnings, etc. We think it's out there, but it's within the specific sector community itself.
Exactly.
So the problem is when there's a great scaling intervention and people think, wow, we really did a hat trick on this one, it's seen as an innovation of the health sector or the education sector, not of a scaling community.
Right.
And so you might have missed it, I think it came in just a second after the introduction, but I'm part of a community of practice on scaling global outcomes. And we bring together multiple communities of health and education, and we have one on food and agriculture, and we're trying to break down those silos. And I chair the one on fragile states and scaling. And so there's this constant conversation now happening across these different pieces to lift out what are the tactical strategies, the operational, the strategic pieces. So it's still it's in its infancy still. We're still not there in terms of how are we really laying bare the strategies. And I think that's what Gahi's trying to dig into now. Raul said one of the correspondences, we bet the farm on scaling, and I think that's a great bet because this really is the next piece, right? If we're going to get to the SDGs, how are we looking at really innovative ways of doing this and getting way past the project piece?
Yes, if I may ask a question. Thank you for your presentation. My question is on feedback loops. So as far as I understand, you were talking about implementing a big program with variation across different regions, let's say, and then selection based on good examples, best examples. That requires a really good feedback loop and gathering of data and so on. Can you comment more on this feedback loops and how to kind of make governments open to negative feedback? Because sometimes that's a problem.
So I think if there's if you're walking the path together, and what the scaling framework would do is basically point out that this has to be a concern. How are you engaging in kind of a conversation around, we're going to get feedback, and it's going to test whether it's the intervention that's the problem or the theory of change that's the problem. And we've just got to be open to it. And it has to connect into the kind of a global movement around this is the way to go. This adaptive piece is the piece we need to all lean to collectively. It's not the fault of the government if it's not working. It's not the fault of a particular partner. It's the collective. I think that takes some pressure off governments not liking that kind of process. One comment about that whole adaptive piece, and you see, PDIA, the problem-driven iterative approach. You see doing development differently, trying to engage in the political side. You see in the UK the strategic testing. It's these approaches, but it's not just about managing adaptively. It's also about how you set the problem statement up as well. In Haiti, after the earthquake, a lot of funding was going towards the IDPs and affected homes. And the government was saying, but this is an election year. If you're not doing anything for the middle class to really rebuild, then we're all dead, right? And so you've got to basically change the scaling scope to also be fitting and negotiating around the political imperative. So in that sense, the whole recovery of Haiti then played into this bigger piece. But if you're not attentive to it, if you're so stuck in sort of a project technical lens, who's watching over that entire process? Who's sort of the overseer of the entire dynamic as it plays out? So I think the chief executive board for coordination of the UN just kind of minted a new resilience strategy that kind of blends the the SDGs and resilience together. I think it's kind of getting those processes into play to really orient major risks that are political and economic, and then trying to figure out just how your scaling work is trying to navigate those complex risks is a key piece on the adaptive side as well.
Thank you, Renata.
Renata, I work here in the policy department, Sustainable Development Cluster. Just a very brief question. So when you're making this analysis of the feasibility to do a scaling up on a critical area, I guess you also, because you mentioned this quote by Fukuyama, that the social capital is the basis, the foundation that actually holds everything in absence of a state, functioning state, right? And I think we've seen that in many situations, including Somalia. But what about when you are actually coming to a community and you're thinking about scaling up and your first analysis is that the social capital has been really deeply fractured? In the case of Rwanda, where you have communities that has a deep ingrained distrust, right, for obvious reasons. Or even in the case of Cambodia, that still today we still suffer, an issue that reconciliation takes many years to come into place, and to talk about social capital that can really think about these different layers you were talking about, bonding, bridging, and linking. It's some communities are still not there. So what are the pathways of alternatives to deal with that, with a fractured social capital where trust is not there?
So that's great. And the one thing I should mention is the process of doing this and having the scaling coordination function, it needs to start crowding in more than just the folks in the specific sector. It has to bring in the conflict specialists and the political economists and the development folks that can help you set up those questions and try to really figure out what it looks like in that specific context. Because again, the ex ante answer, there is no ex ante. I think Dunflo says, anybody that can tell me ahead of time what you should be doing in a place doesn't really know that place, right? On the point of Cambodia though, the Afghanistan basic package on health services was actually tried in Cambodia first. And it fell down in part, and this is what Management Systems for Health and others have documented, because it wasn't as inclusive. And so it really didn't catch that piece around you. If we're going to really build the social capital again, across the bridging and the linking and the bonding, it has to do all of that. And that was the one thing I said about, if you're not doing all those three things at scale, you're going to have those problems. And so what we give here is a guiding framework of the things, we make visible the things you have to be attentive to really drive the process. But within that, you've got to find your own fixes, turnarounds, second best solutions, etc.
Hi, my name is Rosemary. I work on the SDGs in the Policy Bureau here.
Rosemary, you're famous on Twitter.
She was already tweeting here, by the way.
I wasn't looking you up.
She was tweeting.
The question I have is first of all, it's very thought-provoking. Thank you. And certainly in UNDP, we've also been thinking how to get away from just projects, right? Short-term. So that analysis is, we can take for granted. Obviously, this scaling, this problem and the response in terms of scaling applies not just to fragile states, but to any countries, right?
Yes.
But in the regular sort of more stable middle income country setup, you would say, well, why not just give direct budget support to the government? Let them use their networks at scale, whether it is to clean India, clean toilets, or have digital payments, whatever, right? That's one. The second is, for me, it makes me really worried that, this is so much donor driven, right? So you're setting up things at scale, and thinking now for very fragile contexts, where it's highly dependent on donor resources, right? So what happens when the donor resources dry up, because there's another context that becomes even more fragile and attracts, it seems to be, that the money follows the crises, right? And even though the crisis hasn't changed so much, perhaps there's one that's more dire. So when you're doing something at scale, do you risk actually destroying social capital because you've built it up and then suddenly it's not there because the institutional capacities are simply not deep enough to actually change that? And the third point is, we're part of a group that's working at UNDP to try and operationalize what it means by platforms. So UNDP's solution in its strategic plan, going beyond projects, to try and solve problems at scale, is to set up platforms. And the way I understand it at this point is really that rather than designing a program, because for me, I understand yours as a long scale, vast program, is to set up something that actually attracts the various players. There's only so much you can design at the get-go, but there are some elements in terms of innovating, adjusting, etc., that are very similar to what you said. Do you have some thoughts on the platform? So right now, platforms are the thing in UNDP. We're not quite sure what it is, but every country is encouraged to. In fact, this afternoon, I'm having a meeting on Sudan. They're interested in setting up a platform. I'm not sure what, but we'll go and talk to them, right? So the platform idea is to convene a critical mass of players, with UNDP providing the sort of institutional setup, perhaps some seed funding, some governance, some vetting of key partners, but then others get attracted based on this forum that is magically created by us. And I remember Indy Johar in another innovation forum saying, it's not UNDP's business to scale. We should get out of the business of scaling. He said, what we need to do is set up facilitate the process, and then let these distributed, decentralized digital networks do their thing. So do you have some responses to all these thoughts that are buzzing around?
So the first response would be, great, that's great. The platform, what I will think about it intuitively versus actually having details on it, could be the demonstration effect, in the sense that, look, this is working, and therefore let's try to crowd in others around this and grow. But I would say that's a project approach. That's an approach where you start with something without a framework around it. So it's important to think of, what are we trying to get at economies of scale, and what are the pathways? In other words, walk through the entire scaling process, build a plan, and then think about how the platform can contribute to a major turning point in the scaling framework. Because otherwise, you're just groping around from one thing to the next. That plays into the other question we had about sort of the foresight, the financial foresight. So the one piece is, how do you go from, project funding to something where you're linking, say, emergency funding to concessional loan structure, something longer. But eventually, as you're saying, we've got to get to a place of, say, progressive taxation, where the society can get to a place where they start paying taxes. And what kind of social contract do you need to start doing that? There's a great book that was just done out of Oxford on Afghanistan, which shows that there was so much aid flowing into the government that it neglected or kind of dampened out the building of a social contract for taxation for some of those effects. The scaling pathway, when you're walking through the scaling, say the MSI framework or Johannes Lin's framework, it basically tells you, you've got to think about this. It raises your point. So you're systematically going through a process of saying, wait a minute, this gets flagged. Whereas if you're just doing projects or potentially a limited one-standing platform, you're not seeing that blind spot. So I would just say, I would affirm that point that you've made and say, it's the organizing framework that helps you think through those challenges. And if you don't have a good answer to it, how do you crowd in others that can help you think through it? So this is a major intensive exercise. This is an investment that will change the course of what you're trying to do in these places versus this functional status quo. The first question you had was around sort of distributed networks, etc. Those can be the scaling pathway, but you've got to go through a process, including in middle-income countries. I mean, 46% of fragile states now are middle-income countries, if you look at the OECD list. And that's where extreme poverty is right now, right? It's these major pockets of extreme poverty. So in those places where the market isn't just doing its thing, where there's real difficulties, there's exclusion, there's deprivation, there's destitution, etc., doesn't have to be conflict. And I think that's a great message I want to take here. That it's so good that the development system itself is looking at these issues of how do you deal with extreme poverty as a consequence or a symptom of these fragile broken states and institutions. That's where you've got to then deepen it and say, with the framework, how are we then developing this new approach to social capital, which can really only be done at a big level, like in Cambodia. So again, it's that using this framework to crowd in expertise and dialogue and knowledge, and figuring out, look, where's the political support? How do we get that narrative? Where's the social support? If we don't have that, people are going to reject it, or they're going to go do something else. And so it's that process of thinking through, making visible what's invisible in the process. And what we hope to do is be able to show some second best or some hybrid solutions and the importance of a social capital approach as you crowd in this. You can't just pick up a commercial scaling framework. I think Leslie and I had a quick conversation about that. You can't just look at what the commercial aspects are doing, Skoll Foundation, Charles Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs, they're all talking about scaling through systems and institutions. It's not just about the product or the innovation. And I think Deloitte is getting there too, in the sense that the edges scaling work that they're doing, it's about scaling institutions, not flooding the market with specific widgets or certain outcomes.
I think what you're saying is sort of how do you enable, identifying who can scale and then asking how do you enable them?
Exactly. So that's part of the process. What's your pathway? Is it
not necessarily what you can do, it's what you can do for the others.
Precisely. And that's why the coordination function. I mean, I wouldn't see UNDP coming in and trying to scale something in a country, but you're helping the government or others think through how to do that. And in fragile states, you're trying to solve for not just the meeting of the widespread need, but it's the social it's the pieces that you wouldn't necessarily think of or the government can't think about. And quite frankly, when donors are doing 1 to 2, 3-year interventions, they can't think about it either. So who's going to do it? And there are some very thoughtful donors in that space trying to do it now, especially around things like stabilization. And without this framework, even though they only have resources for 5 years, they say, well, we can't think about scaling. The majority of scaling happens without resources having been associated first. It comes later. And that's one of the fundamental insights from our community practice. So don't just think because we only have 3 years of funding for this, we shouldn't be applying a scaling framework. Right? In fact, it could be cheaper over time to be thinking about economies of scale than just that high-tech, a high-touch project.
Well,
You have
thanks.
to think about inception, right? From the inception, you get go, you think
Yeah,
about
there you
scaling,
go.
right?
Yeah,
So that you put the nuts and bolts needed for.
And the interesting part there is it's not a linear process.
Mm.
So politically, you might have to get the political support first, or you do the demonstration, and then you're kind of talking to the ministry or you're talking to whoever. You're trying to cultivate something that's worked somewhere else, but you're trying to really adapt it into the space.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and everyone, for your rich question. It's been a great session. I do want to make the time for one more quick question from some of the colleagues who have connected. Can you relay that, Etty?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you again for your for the conversation with us and online. It's been a very active chat. We have one topic that keeps on coming up is the community engagement. So we have a question from Manik Mahmoud and from Hannah Sophie Val. Hannah Sophie Val is asking, if scaling is best done via governments that trickle down to the communities, how is the bottom-up approach best included? And just to include Manik too, his question is, what type of community engagement exists in scaling up?
Great questions. So the government has, in traditional contexts, the resource capabilities to scale something, or it's the private sector. But especially in these places where those pieces are compromised, you're really trying to link the formal and the informal together. And when we talk about building social capital, it's including those communities, the informal healthcare workers and education workers and others, to be the front line of what's happening. So the communities are fundamental in the process of meeting needs, and the wave sequence approach that I mentioned around how it was so phenomenal because it linked the informal community structures and the formal together. And the same thing for the basic package on healthcare services in Afghanistan. It would not have worked had you not brought in the community healthcare workers. The same with the point that I made around the polio project that we work on. It's those active agents that are in communities socializing, helping to smooth out and troubleshoot the process of polio. They're the community. We hire them from the community, and so they're fundamental to the process. But the communities alone don't have the financial resources or leverage to scale, and so there's got to be a combination of what's happening. A process of social capital strengthening becomes even more focused on communities, because in the process of bonding those communities and bridging those communities, that's how you create the self-help and the emergency sort of protocols to withstand shocks and stress. And so they're fundamental to the entire process. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, and thanks for those colleagues who've asked the question. Look, I think this brings us to the end of the session today. It's been really informative. Thank you to Gahi as well for implementing calls this. I think the idea is really to bring together different actors from the development world. One last request on my side. I think you've seen the sheet that was circulated. The reason we do that is that after 3 years of the Innovation Conversation series, we're taking stock with a bit more seriously as to where this is going. So you can expect to get a survey for the question. That's okay. That is my ask. So if we ask you, so at some point over the next few weeks to fill out this online survey, and we use the sheet to reach you, so we don't just go scattershot. All right. So then, thank you very much all for coming today. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
So I'm really interested to see, and I'm sorry that I didn't go into that paper, but the MSI framework that you